Lama Rod and Bante, what would you say? Is it spiritual? Is anger part of the spiritual path? Is it wrong? Is it just people's karma? What's your view on those issues?
Well, Bante, please go first.
Oh, I think this is the perfect opportunity, Lama Rod, for you to do a little bit of publicity for your book. And
Okay.
I'm actually very interested in hearing the way you phrase it and frame anger and rage as part of the spiritual journey. So please.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, anger is necessary, it's important. Anger is just like any other emotion. It's vital to what it means to be human, to be in the world. Anger isn't the problem. It's our reactivity to anger. That's the problem. It's our relationship to anger, to any emotion. And so I'm really interested in transforming my relationship to anger. And that has been the heart of my Dharma practice, particularly around emotionality. I want to transform relationships. I want to be in power with and have agency over my anger instead of it having agency over me. And I wanted to reveal to me what it is trying to get me to pay attention to, which is the hurt, the woundedness. And I knew that growing up in a Southern Black community, really within just the heart of like very racist activity, I knew that the anger that I saw around me was really about sadness. It was about hurt. It was trauma. It was about always being denied access to resources, to financial resources, to medical care, to mental health care, which are still very prevalent issues that we're fighting against right now. So anger, can be used to benefit as well. We have to understand on a social level that anger is always pointing to something that's wrong. So my anger is like an indicator that there is harm being done, particularly within, talk about Sangha, spiritual communities, there is harm being done. And my anger has to be seen as an indicator of that harm and not washed away or erased or bypassed by the teachings. I think the teachings are supposed to point us to the work that we're supposed to be doing, not to distract us away into something that feels more comfortable. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I very much agree with what Lama Rod has said. It's so important to acknowledge that when we experience anger, it is because something is wrong. And I think it's a mistake sometimes for us to think that there's this singular thing called anger, that it's just one type of anger and they're all bad. It's just simply not true. It's very simplistic. It's not very sophisticated or nuanced. So we need to understand that there's different forms of anger and that they appear at different times in different ways. So the kind of spontaneous anger that you experience if someone bumps into you and hurts your body, that's a lesser kind of anger than the kind of deep-seated rage and bitter and twisted hatred that you nurse in your heart for someone who hurt you years and years and years ago. And there's also a different sense of anger caused by injustice as well, because that's a feeling that, it doesn't have to be this way, and yet here these things are that are happening and they're hurting. So that's important to acknowledge. Some people say there's no such thing as righteous anger in Buddhism, and perhaps that's true, but at the same time, this anger can be a very useful galvanizing force that helps us to create better, more just, more fair situations for us ourselves and also for society generally. And I think the other thing I'd like to just briefly comment on here is that we don't need to hold on to this anger. It's not permanent. So when people are like, oh, anger is really bad, and it's like, I'm not holding it forever. Anger is part of a process. So we might experience some anger at the beginning of a situation or because of a reason, and we use that as a way to transform it, as Lama Rod says. And one of my favorite suttas, the Lekha Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya 3s, talks about 3 types of anger, 3 types of people that can be compared to an inscription. And the first is the kind of inscription that's etched into a rock. You know, it's very deep, stays there a very long time, you know, doesn't get easily eroded by wind or anything like that. It stays there a long time. So this is the kind of person who holds onto anger. Second type of inscription is the inscription drawn in sand. You know, this is easily erased by the wind, easily erased by the water. And so this is a person who doesn't hold on for too long. Eventually they let go. And then the last type of person, the last type of inscription is the line drawn in water. So as quickly as it appears, it disappears. And this is an ideal, of course, but we can understand that the point isn't to hold on to that anger forever. We understand the way it feels inside. It creates a lot of bubbling, disturbed energy inside. And it's possible for us to acknowledge that is harmful to us as well as others. So we understand that it's there, but we understand why it's there, and we understand how we can let it go.
Thanks, Lama Rod and Bhante. I think it's also important to understand that suppressing our emotions, especially anger, can lead to ill health. You know, we don't want to either act out in a harmful way, nor do we want to suppress. And anger is often a sign that something is wrong, that our boundaries have been crossed, that we're being abused in some way. Of course, you know, the flip side of that is there are men's rights activists who are angry that women get to leave them, and they feel that those women, you know, should be physically restrained or oppressed. There are Christians who are angry that gay people get to get married. So it's about questioning, like, where is the real harm, you know, and examining, like, is my anger prejudiced or uninformed? Have I misunderstood the situation? Am I using wisdom, or, you know, is something really unhealthy here? Because it can so often happen in all religions and in Buddhism that we get into this groupthink, and that's how abuse happens. You know, when we don't examine our own, we're not rational and examining our own boundaries and what's healthy. Also, a lot of the time with gaslighting, you know, there is a Davo thing that happens, which is, you know, somebody tries to get you upset about an issue of justice, and then they say, aha, there's your anger, you're a bad practitioner. And they try to dismiss what you're saying because you're angry. And they also transfer victim and perpetrator. So, you know, they'll say, oh, angry feminist, you hate men, therefore, bad Buddhist. Or, oh, angry person of color, you're a bad Buddhist, and therefore what you say has no truth. You know, it's like, why do you need this identity to be queer? You're holding on to yourself. You're not a good practitioner. And that's just a way of maintaining white hetero privilege. You know, that's their fragility in maintaining their system of privilege, and, you know, so that they don't have to address what we're making them uncomfortable about, you know. Anyway, so there are lots of questions here. Where to begin? Okay, so I am aware of lay teachers identifying as LGBTQIA who are advised not to speak about their gender identity, renounce their attachment to sexuality. Is this possibly a skillful means of reducing obstacles on one's spiritual path?
Should I answer that one?
Go ahead.
So I think that this is a mistake, and it's a form of shaming people for the innate aspects of themselves that are human. And as I tried to point out in my talk, these aspects of ourselves are fundamental parts of being human. And it's often the case in society generally, but specifically in Buddhist circles, we have this very strong idea of what is normal. But it's very difficult for those people who think of themselves as normal to see just how constructed their identity is. And this is a big problem because we have this ridiculous breaking into two parts, you know, the normals and the others. And so people who think of themselves as normal are the ones you've really got to watch out for, because they don't see the construction of their identity, how closely they cling to that identity. And even this idea that you shouldn't have an identity, you know, I don't have an identity, people say, and it's like, that's a very strong identity to construct for yourself. But we need to acknowledge those blind spots, which essentially are privilege, whether it's whiteness or cisgenderedness or straightness, that we don't see in ourselves. And so I would say that that is not a skillful means. We need to accept that people have different sexualities, different genders, different identities, and just work with those people as they are. And it's a mistake for us to especially within the Buddhist community, to somehow think that these states are less important than other hetero cisgendered states, that we shouldn't be able to discuss these. It's just completely wrong. And we should really encourage people to be themselves, whoever they are.
Okay. Do you want to respond to that, Lama Rod, or shall we move on?
No, I completely agree. That was really wonderful. And I'll also add, in terms of when we say that something's normal, we're actually just re-expressing the dominance of the dominant culture. You know, so I think in America, when we talk about normality, we're talking about whiteness. You know, you're talking about cisgenderness. You're talking about heteronormativity, so forth and so on. You know, because those are the dominant kind of behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs in the culture that we're trying to disrupt. You know, and trying to move into queerness, into fluidity, into openness, and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. So I found that Buddhist centers in both Australia and America, and to a certain and also in Europe, are mostly the dominated by white, upper class, affluent people. And, you know, sometimes they're not completely open spaces for people of color or, you know, people from other more marginalized groups or smaller communities. Lama Rod, what would you say that we could do to try and open up those Dharma centers and make them more inclusive? But also to, what can I say? I mean, why, you know, why, it sounds stupid to ask this, but why should Buddhists give a damn about people who are not like them?
Yeah.
And about poverty, and, you know, because I think in the West, we view Buddhism as a very individualistic practice. We come, we sit, we find peace, and we don't think about anyone else. And that's so problematic, because in Asia, actually, Buddhism, the Sangha, the community is a really big part of that.
Exactly.
And in the West, it's not. And we're not as socially engaged as, like, you know, humanist Christians.
Yes.
We're very privileged, and we don't do a lot. What would you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, in the West, Buddhism was funneled into the white dominant, moneyed class. You know, and so it took on, Western Buddhism took on the aesthetics of what made that class of folks comfortable. You know, and so of course that became like the dominant expression of Buddhism, which was individualistic and quiet and meditation based. You know, and you don't necessarily see that as the main expression of Buddhism when we go to Asia, right? When we train and practice in Asia. And so at this point in my life, I'm not interested in reforming meditation centers, because that becomes intense emotional labor for those of us who are representing marginalized communities in the Sangha. You know, and I've seen it over and over again. I've been in that position myself as, well, you know, you're Black and queer, so it's your job to actually be on the diversity committee and do the inclusivity work. And I just find that to be very violent. I find that to be an expression of racism and homophobia, queerphobia, and just really not compassionate at all. And so I decided, I really just decided to create the communities that I wanted to see. You know, and I advise other folks working in Sanghas around inclusivity to actually leave, to reinvest their energy in creating communities that reflects them, you know, and I think that's just a better investment in our energy, you know. And in terms of like why we should care, well, you know, I think that many communities actually haven't really fully actualized compassion yet. Compassion is just something that's very performative. I think part of that performativity is around kindness. We think kindness and compassion are the same thing. It's actually not. Authentic compassion puts us into solidarity with those who are less privileged, who are marginalized, you know. This is why, for me, as a Buddhist, I'm actually deeply influenced by other traditions, other religions and other spiritualities who have a stronger history of justice. You know, and this is why I'm so invested in liberation theology, you know, which is the theology that says that God is on the side of the most oppressed, you know, and the liberation theology actually comes out of liberation struggle in South America, you know, political liberation struggle. And so that theology has a strong base in social liberation. And we don't have that yet in Buddhism. You know, we don't have a liberation theology yet. Radical Dharma was like our effort to begin the conversation, but it's not quite there yet. You know, so we have, I think we won't see the Dharma that we will see in the West until Dharma begins to reflect all of us in our individual communities, and it definitely begins to reflect the communities that are actually consciously being marginalized from the dominant spaces. So,
well said.
In Australia, Buddhists are 2.3% of the population, which is a really small amount. And I think many of those Buddhists are kind of nominal Buddhists, so not necessarily practicing. And so just thinking about this idea of, you know, whether you should engage in order to change, which sounds like quite a quaint notion now, but was quite radical, this idea that you should, from within an organization, from within institutions, try to change. So I agree with what Lama Rod was saying, which is, you know, just go and start your own communities. But the reality in Australia, for example, and probably in America as well, is that there's a very small amount of organizations already, and the communities are split across different traditions, different ethnic groups, and location as well. That's an important factor in a big country like Australia. And so it's hard to start a community, and building a community in itself is also really hard work. And there's already these existing institutions and organizations. So I agree with what Lama Rod is saying, that yeah, we should totally start, you know, organizations for the things that we want to see happen in the world. But there still is, I think, a role for us to play in engaging in order to change. And it is emotional labor and it is hard work. And I appreciate that. And I think it's unfair that marginalized groups have to do this work. But as I saw in some of the chat coming up during the talks, there's this necessity for us to engage in order to have these conversations. And sometimes I'm surprised at just how little we understand about each other. And so I think there's still a necessity for us to have these conversations, to be involved, to make sure that we're not continually othered and excluded, and that the people who just happen to go to that center, just happen to go to that organization, have a better experience than what they might have if we had not started to create this conversation. And the other thing I want to say is that we as consumers of Buddhism really have the power in that we don't have to just listen to those people, those groups, those organizations that have the biggest megaphone. And I think there's a tendency for us to just tune in to the loudest voice. But there's so many different types of Buddhists, different types of activities that are happening, and we can spend a lot of time complaining about those loud voices. But I think, as Lama Rod was suggesting, it's up to us to kind of to listen and be a voice that maybe is at the edges, at the margins, and people will be able to tune into that as well. So we need to carefully choose, as consumers of Buddhism, what we listen to.
I think there is a problem in the minds of white, straight people that perhaps if they see a group that is mostly for people of color, they think, oh, that's not for me, that's for them, and I wouldn't want to invade their space. Or, you know, if they see, for example, Rainbow, they think, okay, it's a group for queer people, so that's not for me either because I'm not queer. So it's a kind of a question of like creating a space where the two rivers can meet, you know, like where people feel they can ask questions and things like that. But I guess also there has to be a certain level of safe space and activists being protected, you know, from trolls. And because I've seen some pretty nasty racist and homophobic and sexist stuff in Buddhist sanghas. But also, you know, I guess we can, as more privileged people, we can educate ourselves and actually listen on YouTube to the teachings of, you know, BIPOC teachers and queer teachers, and inform ourselves and, you know, look for good resources on anti-racism and queer justice and so forth, right? We can educate ourselves as well. We don't need to ask people to spoon feed us.
And this is one of the things that kind of troubles me the most, is just the amount of, I guess, ignorance about these issues and people's lack of desire to inform themselves. So, you know, there's the internet, like, please use it. You know? I saw even in this chat people saying, oh, what are these acronyms in the rainbow acronym? And, you know, just Google that, because it's your responsibility to inform yourself. And we do it for so many other things. Please don't ask people to always explain. Please don't ask people to always do the work, which is emotional labor. For me, making that video was a triggering experience, having to talk again about issues that really affect me very deeply. And so I appreciate what Lama Rod was saying about activist fatigue and the kind of emotional labor behind that work. And so there's so many resources. Please just access them. We do it. We want to find out the best pizza restaurant in our neighborhood. You know, we can Google that. You know, we want to find out how to be an ally. Just Google that. There's fantastic resources out there.
Yeah. Or if you want to like hook up, you just, you know, put on an app and just swipe to the right. You know, and so do the same thing with educating yourself. Pick up the app, you know, and just like get as engaged with educating yourself as you are with trying to like experience pleasure in the world. You know, turn that energy around. You know, but like I just wanted to like, you know, I've seen a lot of things, but I, you know, just wanted to say too, just add on to this, you know, really powerful discussion, is that, you know, we're not going to save everyone. Like, everyone just won't be able to do the work or have interest in the work. And we have to come to a point where we recognize that, you know, because if we cross that border, then we cross this border into forcing people, and that becomes violence, you know, and then people shut down, you know, and then nothing ever happens, you know. And so much of like my work and the songs are just saying, you know what, we really have to do this minimal level of work if like I'm going to be here supporting you all. Like, you have to do this really basic thing. You know, you have to read this book, you have to watch this documentary, you have to show up to this discussion, and then there has to be actions that we agree on afterwards that begin to shift the environment. If people weren't willing to do that, I'm afraid for those of us who find ourselves in those positions. I think that it's just going to turn into being really a burnout situation, you know. And I want us to come into spiritual communities to practice, not to be like the diversity director, you know. Like you should be able to practice just like everyone else. And when you're not practicing, then I really have to ask you, well, why stay? You know, unless you're on the payroll and getting paid to do that, you know, because you're certainly not practicing. You know?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? Goodness me, my brain has stopped working. So basically you're saying Tinder and Grindr for social justice then, Lama Rod?
I've seen, you know, I've seen on the apps, people using the apps for organizing. There's a lot of like Black Lives Matter stuff that people are putting on hookup apps, you know, on like, people may put up like pornography as a post, and then once you go and click the comments, it's all social justice stuff. It's all support this group, support that group, read this book, follow this person. I think it's really, you know, quite clever, you know, what's happening in different communities around organizing right now.
Yeah, I think good point.
Yeah.
Bhante, maybe we're missing something in our Dharma teachings.
A honey trap. Yeah.
That's not your territory anymore.
Forbidden fruit.
Leave that work to me.
Okay.
You do it for both of us, Bhante. Lama.
A true bodhisattva.
Give you our cell. You can do it. There's less of us on the market. There's more space for you now. So, you know, part of being an ally, I think, is also listening more than you speak. You know, I find as a woman, a lot of men comment and say how they think it is for us, you know, rather than listen. And I'm sure that happens with racism and queerphobia too. Like, people are telling you how it is and questioning your lived experience. The best person to learn from is not to share your opinions, but actually to listen to those people and put aside and examine some of your own prejudice, right? Yeah.
We also need to get very familiar with rhetorical strategies. So we need to speak the language of rhetoric, in that we need to be able to pinpoint the kind of arguments people are using and already have some defenses lined up. And this is something that we need to do because we constantly experience the same kind of, I guess, lines of attack from trolls or even from interested people, from well-intended people also. And these things can be very harmful. And so for me, it's easy to just break these patterns of behavior down into types so that I'm not reacting on a personal level, but I just understand, oh, this is the strategy that they're using in this conversation. And this kind of means this is where they're at with this idea or this concept. And it allows me to go, oh yes, but you're just using this. So here's another way you can think about it like this. This is something that we need to do, I think, as activists, because these conversations are incredibly predictable. And that's part of the problem.
It's like what I always say is that, like, I haven't heard anything new about racism for a while, you know, or queerphobia. It's like the same things over and over and over again. And as activists, this is why I'm really an advocate of the education piece, where we can get together in groups, you know, and just really like teach each other actually how to respond to these same old arguments over and over again, you know. And I think that's incredibly important for our practice too, as well, because it challenges us to deepen, you know, as we're trying to like really embrace these counter arguments, you know. But you know, that is an old activist you know, strategy anyway. It's like you just, as Bhante was pointing out, you predict what's going to happen, and then you just create the plan, you know, and just throw it out there. Actually, have everything typed up, you know, and so you just cut and paste. You know, when someone comes for you online, oh, here's a passage
Yeah.
that goes to that argument. You know, it saves time. Or
Haters
just
gonna
block
hate.
people. You're just gonna.
Yeah.
That's what some people do. That's what their role in life is to hate. You know, and you're like, oh, that's so sad, but that's where people get stuck. You know.
Okay. So perhaps we should move on to another question. Somebody said, being trans caused me suffering because I want a different body, not because of other people, but I had trouble making sense of that in Buddhism. Ultimately, I looked at it like keeping my body the way it was a form of asceticism, and you can't meditate well on an empty stomach. Would you add any other ways to look at it under Buddhism?
So I think this was in response to me saying that being queer, trans, or intersex is of itself not a cause of suffering. And I think that I would prioritize your experience in that situation and say, of course, dysphoria is real. And I guess I wasn't trying to take away that experience that you had. I think that there's different societies, of course, we know through history and even today, where having a body that is trans is not necessarily going to be a problem for yourself or others, because those societies have different ideas about gender and different ideas about what it means to have a body that isn't binary. And so I think it's possible for a person to have a good experience of having a trans body, and certainly even within the culture that I grew up in Sydney in the West, I know people who have had good experiences of having trans bodies, but I also know people who have had some really bad experiences. And I think that's mostly a reaction to cultural circumstances. So over time and in different cultures and different ages and different epochs, who knows, maybe one person could have a really bad experience of being trans and another person would have an experience that wasn't problematic at all. But I think what I was trying to say is that mostly our experience of being othered and discriminated against, our experience of prejudice and violence is something that is put onto us by others. And it's not something that we bring to ourselves of its own self. It's something that happens because of those structural limitations that society has.
So two people have had a conversation about the Vinaya rejecting trans people for ordination, or non-binary people or intersex people as monks and nuns. And somebody mentioned that they were refused for ordination and that they didn't want to ordain in a community where there was only a gender binary. What can you respond to that?
So we have to recognize that there is discrimination and prejudice embedded into the history of Buddhism in this regard. It's 2,500 years of discrimination and prejudice. It's not going to be easy to change. And the reason for this discrimination seems to be cultural circumstances at the time of the Buddha. And in truth, we don't fully understand the terms that we have in the Pali text. We don't understand terms like Pandika. What are they? These people who perhaps were a unique caste, or we don't understand the other terms that might be slightly related perhaps today to intersex characteristics. But what we do know is that these two groups of people were banned from ordination at the time of the Buddha. And with Pandikas and intersex people, unfortunately, they're put into the same categories of other people who were banned, like matricides, patricides, so people who killed their parents. And there were other groups as well that were not encouraged to ordain and sometimes banned to ordain because they had various illnesses, perhaps epilepsy, leprosy, and a few other things like that. So we know that not everyone was accepted into the monastic community, and that there were probably valid reasons for some of those, such as communicable diseases, or such as misunderstanding of certain illnesses. And it seems that the types of bodies people had were very important at the time of the Buddha. And so because of the incredibly binary nature of monastic life, people who have bodies that are intersex or bodies that are trans were not admitted to the Sangha. And we do have stories about lay people and also monastics spontaneously changing sex. And I say changing sex, not changing gender, because their sex characteristics magically changed overnight. And so you can think about the reasons for these stories. At least we know that, yeah, there were trans people present and they were there. It's great that we've recorded that. But there's also layers of discrimination. And I'm very careful about glossing over these points. Sometimes, you know, I talk about how inclusive Buddhism is, and yeah, there are trans people and intersex people at the time of Buddha, but the truth is that they also receive stigma and prejudice just as they do today. But those stories about people spontaneously spontaneously having a sex change and then revealing their sex characteristics can be taken either way. On the one hand, those people were told, okay, well, you were a male, you had male characteristics yesterday, but now you have female characteristics. It's okay, just go and live with the nuns community, or the other way around. So you can think, oh, that's a great thing, so trans-friendly. But on the other hand, you can see it as this person was maybe stealth and then got caught out, and then their affirmed gender was rejected by that community, and they were forced to go and live back with the sex that they were perhaps identified with at birth, perhaps. And so there's two sides to this. It's kind of like, that's not the positive way that we're kind of taught to experience it. But I don't want to talk too much, but the fact is, if you're trans, you can probably ordain. You just need to find the right community. Non-binary, it's a bit more difficult if you don't want to be forced to choose. But I want you to know that there are non-binary monastics out there in the world. There are trans monastics out there in the world. And the very first person to ordain in the Mahayana tradition as a bhikkhu was in fact a trans man. And that person was the first trans man who was medically assisted, the first medically assisted trans person in the West. And it's just important to acknowledge these kind of histories. So, but we need to find the right communities. Unfortunately, that's the difficult part.
Bhante, could you suggest a Theravadan community that would ordain trans people?
I couldn't.
If that was asked. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually spoke to Bhante Sujato, and he said that he would ordain a post-op trans person.
Yeah, but I think this is another problem, this idea of surgery and people's sex characteristics indicating their gender. And this is incredibly problematic. And I think that this conversation needs to be continued with those senior monks and with senior nuns, because sometimes there's a level of ignorance there about what it actually means to be trans. And the idea that someone should have to have surgery to be included is, for me, quite problematic.
Do you think it can be done according to the Vinaya?
I'm not going to be drawn upon that at this time, but it's, again, it's a conversation that needs to keep on happening. And Buddhist monastics are a very small part of the Buddhist community, but I want to emphasize that all people should be welcome to participate as fully as possible in Buddhist life. And there's still some barriers to participation for monastics, but I hope that one day we'll get there.
So Lama Rod, somebody said, they'd like to hear more about the practice of grieving.
Absolutely. The grieving, I call it skillful mourning. And for me, I think it is crucial, and a crucial practice in order to be in the world right now, to actually deal with the deep disappointment of what it means to be moving through samsara, and for me, it's the recognition of sadness, it's the recognition of, the despair, hopelessness. It's the recognizing, the touching into it, allowing that energy to be in my experience, and then actively like allowing that energy to kind of move through my mind. It doesn't mean it's going to move quickly, but I feed that energy a lot of space by just watching, not reacting. And in that non-reacting, I begin to experience. And that experience slowly moves that energy through my experience. It's worse when I try to bypass it, when I try to skip over it. When I try to distract myself from the pain, it just intensifies, So that's the skillful mourning. And whenever I feel the sadness, I actually, in whatever situation I'm in, I actually try to stop what I'm doing and to take care of that energy, giving it space, experiencing it, letting it move through. And I think that for me, something that I've started to do in my interpersonal relationships or when I'm in conversation, when I sense that someone is actually touching into something that feels heavy, feels sad, I actually help them to hold space for it, because I think sometimes when we're in conversations, when something painful comes up, you're like, oh, I'll be okay, I'm fine, let me just like pat it down and get rid of it so we can continue talking or being in the meeting. Instead, a really radical act is to say, you know what, let's stop, and I want to support you and offering space to what's coming up for you in the conversation, or in the meeting or in the presentation. I think we have to push back against the ways in which in our cultures there isn't space for grieving and mourning when it comes up, and I think that begins to also disrupt these systems of violence that really are about, the lack of emotional labor. Like that lack of emotional labor resulting in realities of people trying to bypass emotional energy and often landing in anger and the expression of anger. Because you're angry because you can't take care of yourself. You can't tend to the woundedness. And so if we allow people to tend more to the woundedness, I think we'll see a shift in our cultures and in oppression.
Thank you. So somebody else said, what is the general consensus regarding the Theravada Sutra wherein the Buddha says to kill anger?
Well, context is everything. So the teachings that the Buddha presented us with on anger are given to particular people at particular times. And this is something that we need to remember with Buddhist teachings generally, is that these were conversations with people who are at a particular place in their life. I think, I don't want to get drawn on specifics of that sutta, but just to generally acknowledge that we can't just take one sentence or one sutta out of context and discuss it as some sort of final, ultimate truth and answer for everything. We need to be much more nuanced than that, much more subtle, much more sophisticated to understand the general tendencies of Buddhist teachings and to kind of align ourselves with those general tendencies. There's a real current of positivity, of care, compassion, kindness, and a purification of the mind that the Buddha points to. But in those particular circumstances where we have the same kind of problem, such as resentment or hatred, that's when those suttas can be helpful to us. But as long as we position that in the general trend, so we don't want to get kind of caught up on this one idea or a particular line and kind of hold fast to it, because that may be a particular view that is useful in some situations, but not in others. So yeah, that's just what I'd say, just as a general tendency, how to approach the teachings.
Okay. So there's lots of comments here. What do you guys think about the idea of karma? I just remember when I first ordained, a woman in a wheelchair came to our Dharma Center, and because we were a poor Dharma Center, we didn't have disabled access to the bathroom for her, and she could hardly fit through the doorway in her wheelchair. And also she'd been in a car accident, which had made her almost a quadriplegic. And she said, I gave a teaching on karma because it was an introductory course with a set plan. And she just looked at me and she said, "So you think this is my karma?" Or she said, "Is this my karma?" And I could feel so much pain in what she was saying. And I started to question, you know, like, what is a skillful way to weave in the idea of karma with oppression, and as someone committed to compassion and justice? For me, that's one I've always had a struggle with. What do you guys think?
I didn't hear this, but there was a very prominent Rinpoche in the Kagyu school who had a public teaching, and this has been in the past 5 or 6 years, who publicly said that Black people do not have the karma to practice Buddhism. So for me, that question points to the ways in which karma can be weaponized, you know, to explain away actual experiences of oppression and marginalization, you know, and obstacles that are actively being created, you know. And I think we oversimplify karma as well. I just think it takes an incredible amount of study and practice to like even get like our heads around like these introductory teachings of karma, you know, because it can be so easily used to like bypass work, you know. Well, you just don't have the karma to be here, so let's not even do it. You know, oh, you know, I'm so sorry that you're struggling with this. Well, that's just your karma, isn't it? You know, it's really violent the way it's used. I struggle with this as well too. And I would just say briefly that for me, I recognize that what I experience is a result of I've participated in the causes and conditions of what I've experienced and what I experience in this life. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that I deserve what I get, you know, particularly if it's harm or violence. Like, I don't deserve that, but I'm not an innocent bystander at the same time. And I'm trying to like find a space in between that for me. But at the same time, it's very complicated. At the same time, I know that like I've had this practice of transforming. Like when I was born, I said, oh, being Black is just, it just sucks. And being queer sucks. But now I'm like, God, I wouldn't choose anything else. You know, so it's all also like the frame of mind that we're coming into this with as well. So this is why I think this is such a slippery thing, you know, to come into karma like this. And so anyway, I have a lot of work to do around this myself.
It's a difficult one for anyone who's socially engaged, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have worked for a decade with the Ambedkarite ex-untouchable community and the Dalit community in India, and for 5,000 years, the idea of karma was used as an interpretation of fate, like you deserve to be treated like shit because you were born into this community.
Yeah.
And whatever you get, you deserve. And it's so damaging And that's why Dr. Ambedkar just took out karma altogether. But actually, karma means action, right?
Yeah.
Karma means
Yeah.
we can change our circumstances, and nothing is written, you know, that everything changes. But surely that should be superseded by the idea of compassion, and that who are we to judge, because the sword of Damocles is hanging over all of us.
Yeah.
You know?
This is something that it's important to mention in these conversations that you have with certain types of people about karma. And I mean, firstly, our understanding of karma is very basic and often incorrect. The understanding of karma in Buddhism has been fundamentally shaped by the Vedic tradition and the Hindu tradition, which is a slightly different interpretation of karma. So it's important to understand that in Buddhism, when we talk about karma, we're talking about intentional actions. And these intentional actions have certain results, but there's all sorts of other things that also cause results in our life too that aren't related. And the Buddha outlines these in his teachings. But the important thing for us to remember is whatever hand we've got in life, we're intentionally making actions all the time. And this means that if we're callous and hurtful and cruel, dismissive towards other people, and use karma as a kind of a weapon or as a tool for harm, then we are in fact creating karma, and we'll experience those results as well. So we need to balance our interpretation with the work that we need to do to make sure that our minds are spacious and full of love and kindness and compassion, not just using the doctrine in order to keep people down or to cause further harm.
There's a beautiful word for compassion in Buddhism, which is to be in sympathy with, or to shake with a feeling of empathy.
Yeah.
And to be in solidarity. So you can't really say that you're practicing spirituality or compassion if you don't actually understand what they most deeply value and what their experience is. And you can't help anyone unless you give them a voice and fully try to listen to their experience, you know. Otherwise it's not compassion, it's patronizing, or it's white savior or whatever. It's not. Sometimes you can harm someone you're trying to help if you don't really understand, and you're not helping as an equal, you know. I think Dorothy Day said, or I can't remember actually, maybe it was an Aboriginal activist group who said that I help you, if you've come here to help, we don't need your help. But if you've come here as an ally and you see that your liberation is bound up with mine, then welcome, you know.
Yeah.
I think that some people have been sharing some good resources about this topic as we've been talking as well, so it's probably worth checking those out too.
Yeah, yeah. So another kind of big issue in the Buddhist scene has been all the scandals of, you know, people abusing their power, and mostly abusing women. But, you know, there have been cases of men being abused as well, or children. And this has really come out in Tibetan Buddhism, with some very powerful teachers being accused of abuse, and kind of exposing the ugly underbelly of patriarchy, and how really there's still a really long way to go in Buddhism. Like, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, most of the power is still held by Tibetan men, and although we use the idea of dakinis and so forth, it's mostly just lip service, because women don't actually hold real power or have positions of administrative power. And their kind of very nature, the value of their very nature, is questioned. Lama Rod, what do you see as a solution to this? I mean, we also have a massive problem with us not really supporting English-speaking monastics at all. You know, they just have a massive disrobing rate, and it's so disappointing. And all of the funds are just sent back to India to the Tibetans, you know, this empire building.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that, I mean, this is like one of my frontline issues right now, which is why I'm kind of estranged from my monastery around these issues, as you know, my teacher was also implicated in ethical misconduct, sexual misconduct in our monastery. So that was really hard for our community, and we're still struggling through it. And I've been very vocal and public about it. I think that's the first step, actually, is being vocal and public. It's too much silence. There's so many secrets. My heart broke when I realized all the secrets in my monastery, and I realized how I had been manipulated to be a part of the system that maintained the secrets and the silence. You know, by using karma as a weapon, by saying, oh, if you say something, then you're going to create disruption in the Sangha, and karmically, that's very bad. So you should be quiet. You know, and the ways that we submit to that. And I just had to break through that. You know, it doesn't matter if I believe if I'm going to the hell realm or not. The point is, to be a bodhisattva means that I'm standing on the side of what's ethically right. And for me, what's ethically right is to actually point out harm and violence that's being done and to disrupt it, you know. I'm so grateful to have a really strong activist background and to come from, you know, the Black prophetic tradition. I also come from like Black, you know, communist, socialist traditions, you know, where I grew up, where I can just go back and say, no, this is right. It's like I have to do what's right. I have to do what reduces violence and frees people, even if my community says that it's wrong. So speaking out, and the second thing, you know, that I'll just, you know, just offer is that like we, as Western communities in the tradition, we have to learn how to be a little more independent. Like we have to start really, there's a way in which Tibetans hold on to the hierarchy, you know, because I think often they feel as if the religion is the only thing that they have that makes them valuable in the world right now. And if they let that go, then we won't need them. Like we won't care about the Tibetan liberation struggle. We won't care about communist occupation of Tibet, right? Like we won't need them. And I feel, my heart breaks with that. I get that, I understand that. You know, at the same time, I want to be free. You know, I want to have agency over my practice and to make decisions, you know, about how I proceed in creating a Dharma practice and a Vajrayana practice that reflects my life, not the life of my Tibetan teachers.
It is really hard when the system of patriarchy is so ingrained that everything focuses on the Lama and says that without the Lama there is no path. Guru is Buddha, Guru is Dharma, Guru is Sangha. Also, Guru is the originator of all goodness, and you know, and then behind your back the Lama's abusing women and
exactly.
And in so many ways. Yeah, sorry.
One of the great things come out of last year's Sakudeta Buddhist Women's Conference here in Australia was the formation of the Alliance for Buddhist Ethics, which is an organization, I think Jack, I'm not sure if Jack is still here with us on this Zoom call, but it's an alliance where a group of women who have been in or around abuse in their communities have formulated a charter about non-harm, and that teachers can sign up for and to articulate this, that, you know, I'm going to be a teacher who doesn't harm, which, I mean, you wish you didn't have to have, but it's a public document placed on websites, and it's a good way to kind of just bring attention to this issue and to say explicitly in our community, these are the values that we have, these are the guidelines that we're going to adhere to, as well as other safeguarding policies as well that are really important, and grievance procedures and strong guidance from people who are informed and know how to handle complaints. So I think that this situation is changing, and I think that in the future we won't have these sorts of conversations as much. But I'd also like to suggest that people generally inform themselves about cult-like behaviors and watch documentaries about cults and see where your own actions give power to others and how that power is being used or abused. And so it's part of our responsibility as spiritual practitioners, unfortunately, is to be aware and to understand how these dynamics work. And to have some access to that knowledge is really important, because it means that you'll grow more as a spiritual practitioner, and you won't be in a situation where you're likely to come to so much harm. So I really recommend watching some fantastic cult documentaries. Watch the documentary called Holy Hell, which is about a pseudo-spiritual cult in LA during the 80s and 90s, which was an abusive cult. And David Wants to Fly, about the TM method. There's so many
Wild
good
Country.
documentaries. Wild Country. These things are really important, and I actually think of them as research. You know, research and a protection, and so that we have a way of understanding how we put ourselves into these situations, as well as understanding why people abuse power.
Okay. So, Lama Rod, I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, the role of the guru is so idealized and so strong. And, and you know, the ideals we have about Tibetans as a kind of Shangri-La.
Yeah.
You know, Tibetan lamas as just being kind of miraculous and magical, which have, you know, fed into the abuse that happens and just made it impossible for like Western monastics, or even a lot of, you know, Vajrayana non-Tibetan teachers to make much headway. I mean, how do you see a future? Is there something we can do to address this? I mean, without being appropriating, that's the thing.
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think, you know, with what I said earlier about actually just leaving the system and starting another thing, and this is what we did with Bhumi Sparsha, actually, that I co-founded with Lama Justin from Boydash, where we were just like, we're just tired. We're tired of trying to educate the lamas, the Rinpoches. We're tired of going to India, you know, to try to have these conversations, which we were just in India in January, in March, before the quarantine really hit, trying to talk to the leaders of our, you know, of our tradition. And, you know, you just get to this point where we're like, we actually just have to take a stand, and we just have to just do what we feel that we're empowered to do. And we just, that's that level of activism, you know, where I can't actually keep waiting around. I actually have people that need me to step into my role as a teacher and to begin to create communities, you know, where we feel included, you know. And we're not trying to fight with the lineage. We're not trying to, you know, declare war or anything. We're just saying that, like, we have a right to exist and we want to be in power together, you know, because you actually don't get the nuances of our culture, you know, which is why a lot of these abuses keep happening, you know.
Plus,
and so the guru, and the guru is just the mirror. Like, and that's my other part with the guru. The teacher should be reflecting back to me my wisdom and my agency. The guru shouldn't be this object of veneration where I'm pouring all my agency into. I'm the one who's going to get me free. I'm the one who has to do the work of liberation. So the guru has to help me to understand that for myself. And so I think a lot of teachers come into the role of teachers, and this is the case for Tibetan Rinpoches, where they're just kind of recognized very early, and they're not allowed to move through a maturation process. Like, they go from being kids to being these authorities, you know, which I think is just really harmful. You know, so they start acting out and playing out all their unmet needs that they were never allowed to fulfill, you know, growing up. So we have to challenge that and call that out, you know.
And I mean, how healthy? Sorry. How healthy is it for a man to be raised with no women around him at all?
Exactly. And to be raised, quite honestly, around pedophiles.
Mm.
You know, I mean, this is the scholarship and the tradition where there's violence that people experience trying to expose, this work, like the reality of the level of pedophilia that happens within monasteries, you know?
I knew some Western nuns who got a death threat for trying to just speak out about their frustration at the Dalai Lama not allowing full ordination, even though, he asked them to research it, they did. And finally, when he got all the proof and all the scholarship, he still said no. So yeah, it's a big problem. But I guess, as you say, walk with your feet and look at what your center is supporting, whether it's supporting white heteropatriarchy or not,
There's a
I
shadow
saw
of
there's a
the
lot of there's a lot of questions coming up on
There are,
on the
yeah.
chat. I don't know if we should respond to them.
Lama Rod, do you have 5 more minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Mhm.
Okay. So somebody said, okay. Somebody said, how do we engage with people who may not agree with us and not completely write them off?
Mhm.
Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, no, I would say, I think compassion is where we turn back into, I can be with someone that I don't agree with, but at the same time, I can also remember that they're human, and that they have needs and wants, and that they're also experiencing suffering, and that their views may come from this place of, I don't know, this may come from a place of suffering, so I just always want to be reminded of that. But I don't actually have to like take on their views. Like when I'm around harmful views, I'm saying, in my practice, I'm just saying, that's yours. That's not mine. And compassion is protecting that space for me. So.
And I think one of the dangers that happens to people who are marginalized and oppressed is the desire to convince other people. And this can be a real trap, especially because some trolls are very good at toying with you and will take a lot of joy and relish in stringing you along like a cat with a poor mouse. So there's that aspect that there are very bad faith actors who we engage with. And there's other people who are just simply intolerant and whose views are not likely to change, no matter how hard you come at them with facts or figures or conversational strategies. And it's wise and skillful, and this is something the Buddha actually recommended, to ignore people. And this was really liberating for me when I worked out, I don't have to do this work all the time, and that it's actually skillful. And it's skillful because of the harm that you do to yourself in trying to convince people, and the harm that you can create in, let's say like a chat room or a room full of people that becomes very hostile and antagonistic, and there's sides chosen. And then the disturbed mind, which comes from trying to convince another person, and that fractured, fragmented, shattered mind that you can have, which is debilitating and exhausting. And sometimes I'd just rather be happy. And if there's one or two people I can't kind of convince of my point of view, then so be it. They're going to have an even harder time trying to convince me that they're right. And we know how difficult it is to change ourselves. It's much more difficult to change other people, perhaps impossible.
Sometimes you can feel like it's almost everyone who doesn't agree with you, though, or doesn't care about your issue.
Look to those people who agree. Look to those people who are helping. Look to those people who are allies and supportive. It's another danger that we end up looking to, I guess, convert or convince people, and we feel like we're often at war with the world. But when I look more closely, I see so much support and so many good people around me, people who are kind and caring and who have compassionate hearts and minds that are just and fair. And so we need to balance out our view of the world. Sure, there's a lot of really horrible, irritable and nasty people out there, but there's so much goodness and so much kindness, and that is what will nourish us.
Thanks, Bhante. I think probably we should wrap up maybe just with one more question, and then I'll stay online to answer, just to type in the chat bar, and if anyone else wants to do that, we can. About emotional authenticity, you know, because we have this ideal of Buddhism which is so high and so perfect, and a bodhisattva is never angry, and arhat is beyond defilements and never discriminates and feeds themselves to tigers and stuff. And then we have who we really are. And, you know, how who we are might be different to the dominant paradigm of heteronormativity or maleness or whatever. And Bhante, Lama Rod, I remember you once said that there was a time in your life where you got depressed because you were trying to be a perfect Lama and not an authentic Black queer man. So how do you guys see emotional authenticity playing out as your role as Buddhist teachers and practitioners? Is it important? How do you know when it's a defilement or when it's actually healthy and something you need to be honest about?
Yeah. I find myself, sometimes I feel heretical because I feel as if like sometimes Dharma isn't the first material that I go to, you know, sometimes it's mental health literature, it's, you know, it's something else. And for me, I had to really, when I went through depression, that depression opened the door to practice for me, which I'm grateful for. But when I came into practice, I realized that me being with my emotions was the first time I'd ever truly felt human and grounded and connected to folks. So I never had this idea that wasn't the path once I came to the path, you know, if that makes sense, you know. And so when I became a Lama and was being forced into this role, and a lot of that sadness started coming back up for me, I just said, you know what, I want to be my most authentic self. And if this actually collides with Dharma, then I will choose the authenticity over the Dharma. You know, but I think being authentic is actually an expression of Dharma as well. You know, because if I'm my most authentic self, then I feel in my practice I am at the same time my most least violent self as well. And for me, the reduction of violence is my basic ethic in Dharma practice.
Yeah,
we have to remember as Buddhist leaders as well that we inherit a huge array of performative stereotypes that we're kind of are foisted upon us by our supporters often. And so we have to perform the authentic version of being human, not the idealized version, if only because that means that our supporters, people that we work with in our community, can access that authenticity in themselves rather than this fault-finding, perfectionistic, self-hating self. So it's good for us to model flaws and to model growth and those sorts of things, which are authentic aspects of ourselves, not to present ourselves as perfect or beyond reproach, which is, as Lama Rod pointed out, a kind of form of violence. And I just noticed there's a lot of chat things happening as I'm watching and listening. There's some people asking about learning opportunities with Rainbody. And one of the things I've done to stop being asked the same questions so many times is to compile a really exhaustive resource page on the Rainbody website with lots of articles, some videos. There's some videos by Lama Rod, some media releases, all sorts of things about being an LGBTQIA+ Buddhist and ally, and I encourage people to check those out. And also there's other events happening all the time with Rainbody, both online, soon in the future again in real life here and also overseas. So please do connect with Rainbody if that's something that appeals to you, and let us know if there's something that you want to see Rainbody do, and we'll make it happen.
I believe Rainbody is doing a retreat every Sunday, is that correct?
We've just been running a 4-week series on the Brahma Viharas, and that will wrap up this week with a teaching on equanimity by a senior Australian monk in the Vietnamese tradition who's queer, and his name is Tay Tong Thap. He's a chaplain, and we'll be talking about equanimity. So that'll be a really good one to come along to. You can register on the Rainbody website. Shameless self-promotion finished.
And Lama Rod, you have this amazing book coming out, which is out, called Love and Rage.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And do you have any upcoming teachings you'd like people to know about?
Yes. I will be doing a course on Love and Rage, a 6-week course, and we're going to announce that hopefully the next week. And the best way just to stay connected to that is to just sign up for my email list on my webpage. And I do also have an events page as well. And so we try to maintain that as well. But signing up for the email list is really the best way to stay connected to everything that I'm doing. You know.
So,
and Lama Rod, perhaps in the future, you could share some of your experience with our Rainbody community as well, and I invite you to. I'd love for that to be a possibility. I'll just put you on the spot publicly. Okay, good.
No, I would love that. Yes, absolutely. I would love to connect and offer what I can.
Very good.
I've been called to Australia, like spiritually, for years.
Yeah, come and hang out.
I would love to. I would love to come to Australia. I just have been pulled for years. I just haven't had the excuse, you know, to get there, like our connections.
Okay,
hello.
Well, you're very welcome.
Yoke Magazine, Bodhicitta, Dakini Monastery, and Rainbody are now inviting you. Just tell us when you're free, but maybe we should wait till this corona.
As soon as America gets its act together, I will
Okay,
be able to, that's going to be a while. Give us a good year to get through this.
When they're not shooting at people in the street for fighting for human rights.
Or like getting the disease under control, or having a president that's going to like end the rest of the world through his ignorance. I mean, it's just this is a list right now for us.
That's a reason to come here, but we have less.
Get away.
We have a functional democracy.
And Yeshe, just before, I know we're probably trying to wrap up, but I just wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you do, and for all of the shit that you've copped, and that you are still here as 20 years on, and that you're still fighting the good fight and still caring about other people. It's a real testament to your spiritual development and your beautiful mind. And I want to especially thank you for organizing this festival and all the great speakers that have been here. I've really learned a lot. And I think the longevity of these videos will help many people in the future. So I really do appreciate your work.
Absolutely, I second that. I have seen all the shit that you've gone through online, you know, and it's been vicious and violent, you know. And yeah, I've gotten some of that as well, you know, but you just hang in there and just keep doing the work. And so I just think it's really important, you know, that we just support each other through this. You know, it's so hard to be out front like this, you know, embodied in the way that we're embodied, you know, with our complexities. It's just so much violence that gets directed towards us. So I'm really grateful, and, you know, I just want to help out as much as I can. You know,
I really
it's
appreciate
really, you know.
Fabulous people for offering your support and for coming today and being allies, and I'm your ally too.
Yes.
So if you need me, just call out my name. So thanks. everyone for coming today, because without you, we also don't have beloved community. And I hope you can take away some positive things to act on, some things to read, and some issues to become a wiser and more compassionate and happy person and make the world a better place, because we're all interconnected. So well-being is not just a personal matter, it's a communal one. So thank you so much to Damath and Dharmanet for hosting this event, and the teachings will be online on the Dharmanet YouTube channel as well as Bodhicitta Foundation channel. And you know, donate if you can. The link is in the chat bar. And because we only really made enough money just to pay the people speaking, we didn't make any profit or anything. And we'd like to make a donation to Black Lives Matter.
And of course, as you know, Theravadan monks, we can't really receive money or direct it, but it's great if the money that you perhaps putting aside was to go to a good cause.
Right. I was going to buy coffee, but yeah, okay. No, I really will donate it to Black Lives Matter.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so, and if you have any other questions or concerns, I'll go over to I'll stay here online just a little bit responding to the questions, but we'll also be active on Festival of Radical Awakening Facebook and Ayeshe. And we hope to do more of these events in future and build Sangha, because I think we all have a lot in common. And I just, you know, as a kind of borderline queer person, and maybe as a borderline straight person, I just want to say to all our queer friends and our BIPOC friends that we're here for you and we believe in you and we're here to listen to you and we welcome you in our communities. And I'm doing what I can. I'm still pretty stupid and clueless, but I'm doing what I can to, you know, elevate those issues. So may all beings be happy. Thanks so much and take care. Yeah.